My name is Dean Caputo, and this is my presentation. I'm a graduate student at the American Military University in Charlestown, West Virginia, pursuing a Master of Arts in Humanities. One of my recent classes called for a research paper on one of the great books. While many of the great books in this collection go way back, I thought, why not go all the way back to the very first literary text in the ancient corpus and start at the very beginning? So I conducted my work on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And therein was the start of the creation of a monster, my very own Huwawa, if you will. There is no shortage of books and translations on Gilgamesh. I chose one authored by Sanders. I suppose, as perhaps many students do, I could have simply picked up a copy, read it, analyzed some aspects of it, and wrote a paper. That is, in my opinion, an unequipped approach to this story. As the glutton for punishment that I am, that was not enough for me. This is not because I necessarily look for trouble. No, it finds me quite well on its own. Rather, I felt an innate need to get down to the bottom of this story so I could conceptualize how the epic culminated. My questions were very curious at first. When and where were the tablets found? Who found them? How was cuneiform from an extinct isolate language deciphered, and who deciphered it? How can we be sure of the validity and the provenance of the decipherment? These questions and more seem to have been answered within the first 50 pages of Damrosch's The Buried Book. However, upon conducting additional research, I found confusing and troubling areas that led to additional questions needing answers. Why are there different versions with different subplots? What are these Sumerian sources on which Kramer was so bent? Why do the character names vary between versions? And why in the world is this tablet 12 attached to the story? What are these pen and nail tablets? The further I got into the literature, the deeper the mystery became. Historical literature is continually superseded by new discoveries and newly published fragments from private collections. Why is Rawlinson getting a great deal of the credit and not Hincks? The progressive developments in decipherment supersede prior multifarious interpretations, and on it went. Just as civilization dawned on Mesopotamia, it dawned on me that I wanted to write a student guide, an interdisciplinary, perspicuous approach to the metamorphoses of the epic for students outside of the specialty fields of Assyriology. I wanted to get down to the nitty, but not necessarily the gritty. So I hit the library, dug up my 7th grade social studies notes, and began to outline the paper. Just as I wanted to start from the beginning in my studies of the humanities, so should this paper start from the beginning. I thought it would be important to journey back about 4 millennia for a perspicuous review of the ancient city-state kingdoms, nascent writing systems, geocultural timelines, and the Babylonian and dynastic periods. This is what I believe makes this paper so widely applicable. According to Robert Chadwick in his book First Civilizations, the available sources to teach on this subject are, quote, in many instances unsuited to the needs and scholarly capabilities of undergraduates. In my thesis statement, I tried to encompass all the aspects I intended to cover in the paper. Here's what I would like to cover this afternoon. These topics require some supporting background information, perhaps not for a scholarly audience such as this. In order to illustrate the intent of the paper, I'll be glancing over some of the areas I found requisite for a student's comprehensive understanding. First, we consider the antiquity of the epic and its ubiquitousness. For students who could not find appreciation in these, I found a resonating statement from Philip Freeman that he uses with his students. The subplots and happenings in any of the versions are prevalent and relatable. Quote, almost every joy and sorrow students face in life was revealed in Gilgamesh millennia before they were born. As a visualist, I thought it would be important for students who do not generally think back so far into our history to have a reference table with which to reflect on the before Common Era years. I found this helpful to me at first to get accustomed to thinking in this manner and not having to do the reverse math in my head. We start with Gilgamesh in ancient Sumer, now modern-day Iraq, thought to be the 5th king of Uruk, according to the Sumerian kings list. He ruled a walled kingdom in the second of the early dynastic periods, thought among scholars to be perhaps the first civilization with the characteristics of an actual city. As a reference, I charted this for the reader. Mesopotamia was never an actual country, and there were no peoples who actually called themselves Mesopotamians. Meaning between two rivers, Mesopotamia was situated between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and later, in addition to the Sumerians, comprised the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. Let's continue now with the Sumerians, since for all intents and purposes, theirs is the first history known in the region. However, what I found most interesting here is that from whence they migrated remains unknown, as is the ethnicity of the black-haired people. Their language was and remains today an isolate, yet they showed up pre-skilled in agriculture, irrigation, architecture, government, and commerce. Next were the Akkadians, who were more than likely from Akkad and who spoke Akkadian, a language of Semitic origin, like others such as Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic. The Akkadians all but stamped out the Sumerians and, by about 2300 BCE, had established an empire spanning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. As Akkadians forced the Sumerians to matriculate into their culture, the Akkadians also adopted quite a few of the Sumerian cultural constructs, such as their farming skills and writing system. Just one thing, the Akkadian language had no written expression, nor was it related in any way to Sumerian. Remember this because it's important and it is quiz material. The region, by around 2000 BCE, was later further divided into Assyria, Babylonia, and Elam, or Persia. The written Sumerian language remained a prestigious one among the scholars. I will speak to the adoption of the writing system between unrelated languages later. In the meantime, here's another table I included for the student reader. This paper then briefly covers the historical development of writing systems going back perhaps 8,000 years to pictography, symbols, and tokens. What is widely agreed on in the literature is that the earliest writings discovered seem to pertain to mainly business transactions, records of accounting, lists, and inventories, as well as governmental records. Late into the 4th millennium, around 3200 BCE, a more advanced writing system emerged from the Sumerians, the wedge-shaped cuneiform. These symbols were inscribed on the tablets without spaces or punctuation, but rather in long sequential lines forming columns. First appearing around 3300 to 3200 BCE were the Sumerian text, stories. According to Andrew George, by 3000 BCE, they, quote, could express not only just simple words and numbers, but all of the creativity of the literary mind. The Akkadians, lacking a written expression for their Semitic language, which shared no relationship or characteristics with Sumerian, somehow adopted Sumerian cuneiform writing for themselves. Modern scholars remain limited in their understanding as to just how the Akkadians succeeded in the adaptation. I will cover the decipherment of the ancient writing later. For now, I would like to discuss the independent Sumerian poems that were later interwoven into the literary epic. Samuel Noah Kramer is widely credited as the pioneer who began working with the Sumerian text prior to World War II at the University of Pennsylvania. Tige writes, quote, it was Kramer who first showed empirically that Gilgamesh was based on a number of originally unconnected tales written in Sumerian which did not constitute a single epic. Kramer believed then, as many scholars do today, that these poems were woven together in Semitic languages to create a literary epic much different from the original Sumerian sources. To date, no epic equivalent written in Sumerian cuneiform has been discovered. I included a table to illustrate how the original Sumerian poems transitioned first into the Old Babylonian Epic and then into the standard version. I also show how character names changed in these transitions. So how did we get from having no knowledge of these tablets for thousands of years to discovering them and deciphering the cuneiform scripts in a language which had adopted the writing system from an unrelated ancient isolate language? This is where it starts to get really interesting. I cover the archaeological accomplishments of both Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam. These were the dudes that got this party started in the 1840s in Nineveh. they unearthed hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets. They had no idea what was written on them, but they shipped them all back to the British Museum anyway. It was like, hey, these might be important. Layard continued to be recognized and very highly regarded in his works. Rassam, not so much. In fact, he wasn't properly recognized among scholars until well after his death. A very interesting series of circumstances, or perhaps happenstances, occurred in the life of the self-taught genius George Smith, who, in 1872, while sifting through heaps of fragments in the British Museum, came upon and deciphered an Akkadian flood story, the Deluge, antedating the story of Noah. His decipherments were not always perfect. He first translated Gilgamesh's name as Izdubar, and this speaks to the Sumerian to Akkadian cuneiform transliteration. More on that later. In a respective literature review, much of the extant works credit Rawlinson with the initial breakthroughs in the decipherment of the tablets. Indeed, Rawlinson was quite the accomplished Briton, having been designated to and recognized for holding several distinguished positions. Rawlinson was also known to have excelled in foreign languages, especially those of the Near East. Hincks's work in the early decipherment is often overlooked in the general literature. Where he is briefly mentioned in some papers, he is completely omitted in others. In Irishman, Hincks became a man of the cloth and served as the rector of Killyleagh, Ireland for 55 years. He's recognized by some as having been a pioneer in early decipherment. He is documented as being a very intelligent man with much free time undisturbed by his vocation. Rawlinson, who often comes off as a pretentious bully, considered Hincks a rival and often minimized his accomplishments. David Damrosch's book, The Buried Book, provides a detailed description of Rawlinson's learning of a monument in Behistun, Persia, containing a trilingual script, much like that of the Rosetta Stone. Rawlinson visited there only to find the text inscribed approximately 300 feet above ground on the face of a cliff wall. Rawlinson's ingenuity gained him access to the monument, and he copied the entire inscription over time. With one of the trilingual writings being in an old Persian language with which he was familiar, Rawlinson was able to translate it and work backwards to begin deciphering the remaining cuneiform texts. While Damrosch does not commit to the exact year of this development, perhaps 1835, he does otherwise commit that, quote, it was Rawlinson who made the decisive breakthrough in the decipherment of cuneiform writing. Over the course of more than a decade, Rawlinson worked both independently and with others, unlocking codes and translating the signs and symbols for meaning. He published reference lists and charts of his findings. Since Akkadian was of Semitic origin, and Rawlinson was quite familiar with the Semitic languages, certain biblical names became familiar in the writings, and the translators were able to begin deciphering those names in cuneiform. Subsequently, they were able to then utilize the familiar signs and symbols in the writings to decode other words and texts. Hincks, however, was conducting his own work in Ireland at the same time and was coming to different conclusions in his translations. Kevin J. Cathcart has published works regarding the groundbreaking developments Hincks made prior to Rawlinson. In his paper, The Earliest Contributions to the Decipherment of Sumerian and Akkadian, Cathcart noted that in August of 1846, Rawlinson had announced from Baghdad that he had discovered the semi-syllabic nature of the script, only to find that Hincks had made the same discoveries months earlier. By 1849, Hincks had asserted and later proved that the Akkadian cuneiform had derived from a language of other than Semitic origin. Quoting Cathcart, quote, Hincks had to remind scholars that he had long held it as an established fact that the Assyrians derived many of the values of the characters, as well as their system of writing, from a people who spoke a non-Semitic language. With regard to the Behistun monument scripts copied in 1835 in the Rosetta Stone translation comparison, Cathcart noted, from Rawlinson's own memoirs, mind you, that the trilingual inscriptions Rawlinson copied in 1835 were